Yiwei Wang, who has joined us today to tell us about mountain lions. And it's especially great to hear about mountain lions. I don't know if I told Yiwei, but when I first got out of UC Davis, I went to work for the Mountain Lion Foundation in Sacramento to help prevent mountain lions from being hunted, and it was great. I learned about EIRs and how to rip them up, which is awesome. So Yiwei Wang is just an amazing person. I know her pretty well. She is the executive director of the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory, and she came to the Bird Observatory in last August, and before that, she got her PhD at UC Santa Cruz, and it was studying mountain lions with Chris Wilmers, who has a very large project called the Puma Project throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains, and Yiwei is going to tell us about mountain lions there. She has done conservation work around the world with lots of different species, lots of different animals. She's really an amazing researcher, and I'm thrilled to have her here today with us. All right.
Thank you. Thanks, Lynn. I'll try to live up to a little bit of that. And thanks, everybody, for coming. So today I'm going to talk to you about my PhD research with the Santa Cruz Puma Project, and specifically on the work we did with mountain lions. As you guys probably know, habitat fragmentation and loss is the biggest driver of species extinctions. And of the animals that are most impacted by this are primarily large carnivores, because they have such unique requirements for space use and for prey species. And also there's a lot of negative interactions you hear about in the news between large carnivores and people, and a lot of it is often sensationalized. Obviously there is some danger posed by large carnivores to humans, but there's a lot more danger posed by many other things and by humans to large carnivores. And we also can't predict the ecological consequences when we do remove large carnivores out of the ecosystem. So when I joined Chris's lab, I really wanted to work on conservation projects, and he happened to be starting the Santa Cruz Puma Project, so it was a great kind of entryway for me to work on conservation in the Bay Area, kind of locally. And I'm from Santa Clara, so I was really excited to work both close to home and also on species that I really didn't know about when I was growing up. Like, I grew up in Santa Clara, didn't even know we had mountain lions here until probably college. Definitely didn't think that I would be studying them, but I'm really glad that I was in Chris's lab at the same time that the project was getting started. So a lot of my work is motivated by the fact that a lot of the world is urbanizing. So previous ecological work, a lot of it is concentrated on so-called pristine areas where things aren't impacted by humans. But if we really want to work in conservation, it's really important to work in these areas where humans come into contact with wildlife, because that's where a lot of actions can occur to help wildlife. That's where we can understand how wildlife are responding to people. That's where we have opportunities to actually enact management strategies to try to reduce any conflict that's occurring. And it's also a good place to talk to people about wildlife, because you can't get people to buy into conservation, which is a science that's based not just on science, but on people's values, without getting people to buy into the idea of preserving animals, especially when they're animals like large carnivores. So here's just an example of the kinds of things we get to do. Because we live in the Bay Area and work with the large carnivore species, we get to have kids and have them go into our cage traps, to experience what it's like to get captured, but also to learn about, what it's like to live as a mountain lion in this area. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my work today, and my work is motivated by the idea that we know that conservation efforts can help. There's a couple studies published in the last few years showing that if we didn't do conservation, there'd be a lot more bad things happening, basically to wildlife and to wildlands. But I think in order for conservation efforts to help, we really need to have targeted strategies. So not just kind of broad strategies of let's throw money at things, but we need to really understand animal behavior in order to actually have the right strategies to overcome whatever it is that's causing the declines of population. And at the same time, like I was saying earlier, conservation is not a pure science. It requires, lots of values. So while we're doing the science, we need to also balance it by getting legislative support, which only comes when there's public support. So a lot of our work is based on science and behavior, but also we do a lot of outreach in order to have people actually support, the outcomes and whatever solutions we may propose. So understanding animal behavior, I think, is something people have been talking about for a while, but animal behavior hasn't really been incorporated into kind of these strategies for a long time. A lot of times we just kind of look at, is the animal using this area? If it is, then that's good. But we really have to know, based on its life history strategy, why is it using the area? Is it for breeding? Is it for movement? If we lose this area, how important is it to this animal? Is it going to not be able to have kittens or babies anymore? In which case, we're basically decimating the population. So even if the adults can continue to live, if they can't raise children anymore, then the area is of no value for the species. So for example, here's a male mountain lion who's leaving a scrape mark. And these are important places where they don't see each other very often because they're solitary animals. So in order to communicate with each other, they often leave these scrapes for each other on the ground. Now, if these areas are often used by people or used by dogs, these scrapes can just get destroyed. The dogs can pee over them and mess up the scent. So something that you wouldn't think of as an important behavior is actually, critical to them finding mates, figuring out if there's other males in their territory, figuring out who is the male they want to find. So if we didn't have this understanding of animal behavior, we wouldn't understand that not only do we have to keep, deer populations around for them to hunt, but also places where they can leave these marks kind of undisturbed so that they can continue to find mates and defend their territory. So luckily, we've been able to find a lot more information out about animal behavior because we've had a lot of new technological developments in the last few years. A lot of my talk is going to involve these technologies, so I just want to go over it quickly. On the left is an accelerometer chip. So accelerometers measure your acceleration, and if you guys have smartphones, your smartphones have accelerometers, so your phone knows when you're turning it over and the screen will shift. Same thing on an animal, it'll measure how the animal is accelerating in 3 axes, and I'll show you some videos of that in a little bit. In the middle are GPS collars. So these are collars that we put on animals, just like your GPS devices in cars. They can take the information and location of the animal at programmed intervals, which allows us to follow them during their daily lives without actually following them. And then on the right is a motion detecting camera trap, which allows us to get videos like the one you just saw. When an animal walks in front of it, it triggers the camera, and then we get a recording of what's going on. So again, this is all done under santacruzpumas.org. If you go to this website, you can actually see some of the GPS tracks of our mountain lions and the home ranges that we've been able to calculate based on that information. I'll show this again at the end if you want to take it down. So today, I'm going to talk about mainly the science, but touch a little bit on what we did to engage the public. So first, I'm going to talk about how we extract behavior from a wild animal. So mountain lions are very secretive. We can't just follow them around, like Jane Goodall did with chimps. So we have to do it remotely. Also, we don't want to just always be in their face, right? We want them to be able to live their lives normally and see what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. Next, we're going to look at how GPS tracks can tell us about puma behavior and how that's influenced by humans. And then lastly, we're going to look at how predator interactions with each other are changing or is being changed by living in an urbanizing world. And this is ex-urbanizing because ex-urban is a term that's used to describe low-density development, and a lot of these animals don't live in the city center, obviously, but they live kind of on the edges. So it is an urbanizing world, but where these animals are coming into contact with humans are the ex-urban edges. Okay, So just a little bit about mountain lions. They're also called pumas and cougars and catamounts. They have 64 or 5 different names, and that's because they have a huge range. And pumas are basically the last large predator we have left in California, right? We used to have grizzly bears, which are on our flag now and nowhere else. And we used to have wolves, which are just only returning. So we maybe have a few of them each year, but they don't really, make much of an ecological impact yet. But we have pumas, and they've survived in California and across western U.S., although they're mostly wiped out of the east, except for a small population in Florida, which is called the Florida panthers. So if you hear different names, it's because they have such a wide range that different parts of the world have given them different names, but they're all the same species. So here's a puma kitten, and when moms raise kittens, it's the only time in their lives when they're not solitary. Otherwise, they're generally pretty solitary. Although as we get more and more information, we find they're not as solitary as we think they are, that they actually regularly meet up with their moms, like daughters and moms might meet up, or males and females might, interact with each other. So the more we find out about it, the more we find out that they may be more social than we think. Here's the previous range of the pumas in orange and the current range in red. So you can see they are all the way in South America, all the way up to Alaska and Canada. But from the eastern half of the U.S., primarily because there was a big push to wipe out predators, because people didn't really understand the role of predators in the ecosystem. They're wiped out of a lot of the U.S. Our study areas in the Santa Cruz Mountains. The areas in gray are the metropolitan areas, so you can see San Jose and Santa Cruz. And then we have a patchwork of really nice large state parks. And then along kind of these highways are mountain roads and mountain communities, so low density development. And mountain lions move throughout all of these things. So they don't come into the urban areas very often, but they do occasionally. They definitely move through low density development, and they definitely like the open areas. But even in the open areas, even though they're not developed, they still have a lot of human recreation, so there's still a lot of impacts from just people moving through it regularly. In order to study the animal, we must first catch it. So there's a couple ways to catch it. One is using hound dogs, which follow a puma, and a reaction of a cat being chased by dogs is to climb up in a tree. So once it's in a tree, we can evaluate whether or not we can tranquilize this animal. Another way is to use cage traps. So there's the cage with the puma in it. We get a lot of, sometimes we can find kills that are made by the actual mountain lion, so we can put the kill in the cage. Other times we get donations from Caltrans of roadkill deer. So then we can use those deer and put that in the cage. We used to use foothold snares as well, but that's no longer allowed by the state of California. So no more foothold snares. And for all of these methods, they're not risk-free, but they're generally pretty safe. When the puma goes into a tree, it's generally fine, doesn't get nervous about dogs anymore. Whenever we're catching them by a snare or by a cage, we have transmitters on it that we check every half an hour, so that if it does get captured, we can go out there right away to make sure the animal is not in there for a prolonged period. So once we catch an animal, we put a GPS collar on the animal, and sometimes we put an accelerometer on the animal. We put an ear tag, just like this little bear cartoon illustrates, but we don't do any spray paint of the animal, just because it would probably get wiped off. So we put all this stuff on the animal, not because we want to torture it, and it's not really that big of a deal. We keep the collar at a pretty minimal weight, like about 2% of the body weight. We have videos of the animals with the collars on, and it doesn't really seem to be something they notice. But it's because this is a way we can gather information on the animals, and we can leave them out, in the wild for 1 to 2 years without changing the batteries. So we can get lots of information from it just by capturing it once. So when I was talking about the accelerometers, I said that it operates in 3 axes. So the axes are, forward, back, up and down, and side to side. So we measure the acceleration in all of those axes. So just to show you kind of what it looks like, this is what the z-axis acceleration looks like when the animal is just kind of sitting there panting. You can see it's pretty flat, not much movement going on. And then here it is eating. Again, a little bit more than the flat period, but not much, real acceleration. Oops. So when it's feeding, so now this is when it's walking. So you might imagine that it's kind of walking up and down, so you'll see an undulating pattern. And each of these up and down valleys actually corresponds to a footfall of the mountain lion. And then lastly, here is it kind of running and jumping. So because it's running, it's going to be a lot more acceleration. And you can see compared to the last one, the peaks are a lot higher and it comes a lot more quickly. So with this information, we can get a sense of, what kind of movements they're doing, how fast they're moving. And these are captive lions that are in Colorado, and they were put on treadmills to measure their oxygen intake. So it's the first mountain lions that were trained to walk on treadmills. And so they were trained to walk and run, and then the collaborator that we work with, Terry Williams, would measure how much oxygen they took in, which is it's really highly correlated with the amount of calories they expended. So with this information from the captive lions, we can take the information from the wild lions, predict their behaviors, and look at how many calories they're expending across the day, and then get a sense of where are they really spending a lot of calories and where are they gaining calories. So is the energetic landscape of a mountain lion impacted by where humans are, and how is that impact reflected? So here's an example of the predictions based on the accelerometer and the dashed line compared to the measurements of their movement with the GPS. So you can see it lines up pretty well. Whenever we see a lot of activity in the accelerometers, we also see a lot of activity in the GPS. So the GPS is not active all the time. It's active, at most we had it set at every 5 minutes, but most of the time it's only active every 2 hours or so. So you can miss a lot of information between the 2 hours. But the accelerometers are active all the time, and they're active 64 times a second. So we can get a lot more precise information, right? So instead of getting every 2 hours, they moved at least 2 kilometers in the straight line. With an accelerometer, we can see actually they moved, stopped, but they actually moved more like 3.5 kilometers. So where we would have predicted a certain amount of calories expended from a GPS, we can re-predict with an accelerometer, and it's usually a lot more because the GPS only gives you the minimal distance. So with our first 6 animals that we had accelerometers on, we were able to predict their daily activity and the amount of time, proportion of each hour they spent active. So on the left are the females, and on the right are the males. Because it's only 6 animals, we couldn't really do statistics, but we can get a general sense of the patterns, which is that the males seem to be a lot more regular. So they have a lot more activity at dawn and dusk and very little activity in the daytime. And that the females generally have less activity than the males, but they are more active throughout the day, even though it's a very low level of activity. The first 2 females have kittens, so their activity is even lower than 28F's, who was a female without kitten. And again, it's just anecdotal, but it's possible that if they had kittens, their activity was constrained because their kittens couldn't move very fast. So they couldn't go too far all the time. They had to come back and see these animals. Another thing we did was we were able to map how mountain lions, how much energy they expended killing prey. So here is the GPS track of a kill and what happened afterwards. And with the accelerometer track, we can see kind of when the eating occurred, when the pouncing and attack occurred, and when the walk occurred. And then with the energetic correlations I was talking to you about the treadmills and the oxygen, we could then look at the oxygen intake or the acceleration of the collars on the wild animals, map that to how much oxygen they use and how many calories they use, look at the kills that they made and see how much energy it takes to make different types of kills. So for example, on the bottom it's like killing a kitten, or not kitten, sorry, a fawn. Killing fawn, and that doesn't take that much energy. They're pretty easy, they're just kind of like this big, you just take them. And then on the right are things like big bucks, and then we have a mystery kill that we couldn't find, but it took a lot of energy, so it might have been a big buck by a small female. So this gives us kind of the first look at an energetic analysis of what a kill of a mountain lion looks like, and also helps us predict, how much energy are they spending to get these prey, and what are they actually getting out of it. So we had 6 kills that we were able to get from the 6 accelerometer collared mountain lions. So you can see with the fawns, there's barely anything happening because it's just so easy to pick them off. But then with the bigger fawns and the bucks, you can see real spikes in the energetic use. And then as part of our paper, which was published in Science in 2014, Terry, who's a physiologist, was able to map out the different parts of the accelerometer and what types of, and like the speeds at which the animal was going. So you can see, the pausing, kind of long walks, and then the intense attack, and then kind of not moving for a while because it's eating. So we're still continuing to develop this accelerometer work, and we're working on it not with just mountain lions, but it's been put on leopards and African lions now. So Chris has been to Kenya last year, and he's done some work there too. And we're continuing to do that with our mountain lions here too. So we're having mountain lions that are hopefully going to have accelerometers for 3 to 6 months. So we're going to have 3 to 6 months of data instead of just a couple weeks of data for our next batch of animals. Okay, so next I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other animal behavior work we've done without accelerometers, so looking at what we can gain from just GPS tracks. So animal behavior involves, a bunch of different things. A lot of it is hunting. There's also just general daily patterns, and a lot of individual variability also happens with these large, complex animals. So with our mountain lions, we know some of them are really good at eating raccoons and cats, and others are really good at eating pigs, and then others basically just eat deer. So there's a lot of individual variation, which we don't know if that's because that's how their mom trained them, or it's a response to their environment. When we have modified landscapes, like where humans live, you can see a lot of impacts on where the prey are, whether or not these animals are, when these animals are moving and where they're moving, and also, how often they're moving. So some of the questions we had using, kind of looking at GPS movements and development using satellite imagery of where the development was, are like, what are some of the behavioral responses to modified landscapes? And how do these behavioral responses translate into energetic expenditures? Because if you want to conserve an animal, it has to be able to do 2 things. It has to be able to survive and raise young. And that all depends on energy. So when its energy input is less than its energy output, then that animal is not going to survive or be able to raise young. So I showed you this earlier, which was the map of the accelerometer and GPS movement. So with kind of my pairing of accelerometer and GPS data, I was able to identify periods of activity and inactivity in the mountain lion. And then I used the model that they've used before in dolphins to look at how do these periods of activity and inactivity change as mountain lions are in developed areas versus undeveloped areas, or further from undeveloped areas. So I looked at the transition probabilities for these. So when you have a period of time where you're inactive, you can either stay inactive in the next period of time, or you can go from inactive to active. And same thing, if you started out active, you can either remain active, or you can return to, or you can become inactive, right? So the idea was that we expected that animals that were closer to developed areas would be more likely to remain active and less likely to remain inactive. And we also expected that transitions would occur more frequently from inactive to active. So if you were in an undeveloped area, you could probably, sleep for 6 or 7 hours. So you might be able to remain inactive for a really long time. And if you want to move, you could just move because you were the top predator on the landscape. There's nothing that's going to stop you. But our idea was that if it was in a developed landscape, it may not be able to stay inactive for as long because it might get disturbed by humans, and it might not be able to be active, all the time because it might have to stop and hide from humans every once in a while. And then in relation to this, our other hypothesis was that we would see humans using more energy in developed landscapes. And this is because if we expected them to move more because they were getting disturbed more, then we would expect them to use more calories. And then our second idea was that even when they were making kills in areas near people, they would spend less time at the kills and move further away because they would get disturbed. So for our development variables, we used a couple things. We looked at the development level, basically, so how many houses were there near these mountain lions. And then we also looked at some habitat variables, which is we just, very broad stroke, looked at forested landscape versus shrubby landscape, because we figured mountain lions are big animals. They're not going to distinguish too carefully. And most of the area in the Santa Cruz Mountains is forest or shrubland, and then urban, of course. So we looked at these transition probabilities that I was telling you about. And in a previous paper, we had identified 150 meters as a really important distance for movement for mountain lions from houses. So we compared transition probabilities when mountain lions were within 150 meters from a house to transition probabilities when they were away further than 150 meters. And we compared the two. So what we found was that when they were closer to houses, which is the gray bar, they were less likely to remain inactive. So this is the difference in transition probabilities when they were closer to houses minus when they were further from houses. So when it's negative, it means they're less likely to engage in that transition. So you can see that when they're closer to houses, they're more likely to stay active, and the transition between active and inactive is higher, and they're less likely to remain inactive. And this is for females. And if we look at the percentage of time they spent active, so it differed during the day than during the nighttime. During the daytime, it was kind of the same. But at nighttime, they were much more likely to be active if they were close to houses, which indicates that they might be moving around more, or at least leaving the area because there are people around. And in daytime, it's probably because either they're not generally that active anyway, or because they wanted to stay put a little bit because there were people around. We found kind of similar patterns with males, although it differed a little bit if they were in the forest or in shrubby areas. So again, less likely to stay inactive. So they were moving more or being disturbed more or transitioning between the two active or inactive states. And then if we looked at the time they spent active, again, in the white boxes, that's closer to houses. So they spent more time active when they were close to houses at night. And then, interestingly, in the shrubby areas in the daytime, they actually spent less time active near houses, but no change in the forest. So here again, maybe it's because they actually did kind of hide out during the daytime, because shrubby areas, might be less cover for them or something. We're not quite sure why. So with this information, we could convert the amount of time they spent active and the distance they moved from the GPS points into calories. So for example, for each of these things, for each of these points, we can calculate how many calories they expended. And then we could look at what kind of environment they were in. Were they in high density or high housing environment or low housing environment? And then we could calculate this and convert this into how many extra deer they have to eat a year to feed that extra movement. So I'll show you a little bit of a busy table, but basically these are each mountain lions, and then we looked at the top quarter of development in their home range and the bottom quarter of development in their home range, and we compared how much they moved on average in the top quarter versus the bottom quarter, and we looked at the difference daily of how many calories that was, and then we converted that into how many more deer they'd have to eat each year. So there's quite a range here, but generally, if you look at the average, it's about 3 to 5 more deer that they'd have to kill each year. And then at the top end, there's about 7 to 8. And at the bottom end, which is 23F, is an interesting puma that lives really close to neighborhoods. There's really not much change, possibly because she already kind of lives at a fairly high density place, even in her low density part of her home range. So this is just from movement. We see, they need to move more near people, and that translates into a higher energetic need, and that must be filled by something. In this case, it's probably deer or some kind of prey. And to follow up on that, we also looked at when they were eating, when they made kills, how did being near people reflect affect their feeding behavior. So in this case, we had some more pumas because we weren't limited by just accelerometer collars. And we investigated a bunch of potential kills and confirmed a lot of kills. And out of what we investigated and confirmed, we made a predictive model to predict what percentage of the ones we couldn't investigate were also kills. So we looked at how these animals behaved close to houses. Did they spend as much time at the kill? Did they move further away between eating? So when a mountain lion makes a kill, it usually eats it for several days. So it might go away, take a nap, and return and eat again. So does it go like 100 feet away, or does it go 1,000 feet away to take a nap? And then we also looked at how much time it spent at the actual kill. So this we published last year, and basically each of these are different types of behaviors. So let's just look at one of them, which is the amount of time spent consuming prey. And as you go to a darker shade, it means more housing. And the females are the green shade and the males are the orange shade. So you can see as you get to higher housing, the amount of time spent eating decreases. So significantly different from basically no housing to suburban housing. And I think that makes some sense because they're not going to spend as much time in someone's neighborhood eating as they would in kind of the forest. The other thing that's interesting is the distance traveled increases for females. So this is like how far away they go from the kill when they're going off to take a nap. And that generally increases. But we didn't see as much of a change for males. So one of the interesting things we saw was that males and females behave differently in these cases, and we're not quite sure why, but they do have pretty different life history strategies. And the other 2 points are proportion of time nocturnal, so how much time do they spend at the kill at night versus the daytime, and that goes up as they're closer to houses. And then the amount of time they spend at the kill versus not at the kill. So from the first time they killed the time they killed the animal till they left that kill site forever, what proportion of it was actually spent at the kill versus like at another place resting. And that declined for females. Just to give you a sense of what that looks like, so these are all predicted kills from our model, and the dark areas are where houses are. So here, kill 1 is like one that's close to people. You can see all the gray dots. And kill 2 is one that's pretty far from people. So if you look at kill 1, she kind of spends the time there at night, and then she moves to a further location during the daytime, and then she comes back. Whereas kill 2, she kind of is in the same area, and these 2 are the same scale, so she doesn't move too far away. And this isn't, this is just an anecdotal story about the data that I presented to you, but it tells you kind of what the general pattern is. And then the last thing we looked at is we predicted, based on these behaviors, how much deer mountain lions we need to kill to fulfill their energetic requirements. And again, we don't really see much of a pattern for males, but for females, we find that they have to kill like up to 20 more deer a year when they're living in higher housing density areas. So what this tells us are that we can see that pumas are moving more at night, and this extra movement has to come from somewhere, so it must require them to kill more deer. And also, when they are living in places closer to people, when they're making kills, and deer are often found in people's backyards, so they do pretty regularly kill things in people's backyards. There's a higher energetic cost for them and lower energetic reward, so they're not getting as much out of the food. And then one way to compensate this, it could be to kill more deer, or to kill other things. So if they're stressed, they could kill raccoons or house cats or goats. And the interesting thing is, because this is occurring at places where people and mountain lions are meeting, it could exacerbate conflict, because if they're already energetically stressed, they may not always kill deer, they may kill things that are more easily found. And then, of course, if they need to kill more deer but they can't, it could impact how many kittens they can raise and whether or not they themselves can survive. So it has lots of repercussions, not just for the individual animal, but also for interactions with people and their ability to reproduce. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about, now that I've kind of talked about mountain lion behavior, is a more general study I did on behaviors of predator relationships. So we can see that predator relationships definitely changed as we introduce humans into the equation. Here's like a very brave little house cat meeting a mountain lion without any fear at all. But not just with mountain lions, but mountain lions have a big impact on the mesopredators or smaller predators that live in the landscape too. But some of them, tend to be more sensitive to humans, like foxes and bobcats, and others do better with humans, like coyotes, raccoons, skunks, and opossums. So mountain lions have an impact on all of these, but so do humans. And one question I had was, like, what would happen as you increase human development? Like, how do these relationships change? Well, I found it was a really complicated question, but I got some answers out of it. So there is a theory that called the mesopredator release theory, which is as you take out the top carnivore, you let the medium-sized carnivores do better because they're not constrained anymore. And then that impacts the smaller carnivores. So in this case, it's a wolf that was removed, from, let's say, a lot of the US, which means that coyotes were able to expand and increase in density. And coyotes are big killers of foxes. So coyotes take down lots of foxes, and foxes like to kill mice. So mice do better, and so do deer, because deer are killed by large predators. And whereas the medium-sized prey species like squirrels and rabbits do worse because they're preferred by the medium-sized predators. So with this, there's a lot of implications for how the ecosystem looks, but there's also disease implications too, because mice and deer are the ones that carry Lyme disease. So if you reduce foxes and you reduce the top carnivores, what does that mean for Lyme disease transmission? So again, back to the Santa Cruz Mountains, all these gray dots are houses. So you can see, even though the metropolitan areas are on the bottom and the top, that the mountains are quite developed still. So there's lots of a different range of development. And just to look at it a different way, so you get a sense of how heavily developed it is, you can see there's lots of kind of mid-level, kind of yellowish development here. So within this context, I put up 50 cameras at different levels of development, from 0 houses to pretty much almost suburban density houses. And the cameras were put up so that I could look at how the predators in this community were using trails, in different density areas, and whether or not their trail use presence was impacted by density, or how they used the trail was impacted. The other thing I did was I did a scavenging experiment. So I put up baits at 49 of the cameras. One of them was like literally in a neighborhood, so I didn't put up a bait there. And at half the baits, where it has a little puma paw print, I treated that bait site with mountain lion treatment, and I'll show you what that is. So this is what my site looked like. I put a deer leg, which is that thing, and I tied it to a tree or a post or something. So I tied it, so it couldn't get dragged away. And at half of them, I added mountain lion urine and mountain lion scat, just to simulate the presence of the mountain lion. So I wanted to see if having mountain lions around, or the fake presence of them around, would impact scavengers in any way. And at the same time, I wanted to see, if development would impact scavengers in any way. Okay, so first I'll just talk to you about trail use. And my questions were just, how do the predators use the trails? And how is this behavior influenced by pumas? And also by development. So again, like I said earlier, it was a pretty complex relationship. So I created this kind of conceptual diagram to illustrate it, which is still pretty complex. So in low development areas, it's complex because there's so many moving variables. There's mountain lions, there's also coyotes, which impact other predators too. And then there's development, right? So trying to do this two-dimensionally is very difficult. But generally, the main patterns are mountain lions had a negative impact on whether or not coyotes use the trails. So coyotes use the trails, but they didn't use them as much when mountain lions were also using the trails. And they also had an impact on raccoons. So next to deer, raccoons were the second most prevalent prey item of mountain lions. But they were positively associated with bobcats and gray foxes. In fact, we found very little use of trails by gray foxes when there weren't mountain lions around. So we don't know if it's because they prefer similar habitats or if mountain lions actually protect gray foxes by suppressing coyotes. We also included house cats on there, but house cats are weird because they're not really, bound to natural laws because they're fed by humans. So I don't know really what's going on with house cats in this case.
You're saying if there are mountain lions around, or in this one there are more house cats?
In this relationship, right.
Yeah.
So again, we don't know, these are correlative relationships, so it doesn't tell us cause and effect, and I would say it's hard to say what's going on here with the house cats, because in the next one we get a negative relationship in house cats and mountain lions. And again, maybe it's because house cats only start reacting to mountain lions, or mountain lions only start threatening house cats because they learn to eat them in higher housing densities or something. Who knows? It's not, I would say we need more cameras or more data points to really, if you want to target that relationship. So in higher development areas, there's not as much mountain lion presence, although they're still there. Again, you see the same kind of negative relationship against coyotes and raccoons, but you have a positive relationship with foxes and bobcats again. So this is just kind of like whether they're using the trails and how often they're using it. But I also looked at when they were using the trails and how that's impacted by humans. So the interesting ones are, I think, bobcats, coyotes, and they really have a big shift from less diurnal use of the trails. So bobcats and coyotes become more nocturnal in areas where there's more people. And that can be interesting. We're actually investigating that right now with DNA studies of their diets. Because if bobcats and coyotes are becoming more nocturnal, they're overlapping a lot more with foxes. Because foxes, as you can see, are pretty much always nocturnal. And if coyotes and foxes are overlapping so much, in their use of time or their prey items, potentially, then there could be more competitive competition between the two. Because coyotes, we found, were pretty much kind of half diurnal, half nocturnal, but became, more like 75% nocturnal in areas with higher human use. So this led us to is leading us to investigate the dietary patterns of these animals to kind of see, do their diets shift to different types of species, or do they become more overlapped because their use of the space is more constrained in time now. So moving on to my carcass study. So here's a video of just what it might look like when I have a carcass up, what kinds of animals are visiting. So here's lots of different animals will come see it, although not all of them will feed on it. But here's a bobcat feeding on it. And I'm not sure if I put this one up because a different animal comes up too. But anyway, it's daytime, it comes back again the next night, feeds on it again. Sometimes a bobcat will use it in the nighttime and the coyote will use it in the daytime, and they'll kind of like take turns. So up here's a coyote using it more in the daytime. So I had 49 of these and followed them for 2 weeks just to see who would visit. And it was pretty cool to see, different animals would come and use it. Check it out for a while. And then that's me getting it. Okay, so I got a lot of pictures of animals using it, including kitty cats and birds too. So I had 36 unique species and 28,000 photos of just the carcasses, and over 500 visitations by the mesopredators that I really cared about. So I didn't care that much about the birds, and just because there wasn't that much data, I didn't think I could do much with it. So just kind of a summary of what it looked like. These are the 6 target mesopredators on the y-axis, going from low density housing to higher density housing. And then the reds indicate that those were the ones I treated with pumas, scat and urine, and the blues are the ones that I left as controls. So you can see some kind of general patterns, like foxes are pretty much low density, coyotes were, upper high, raccoons were only in the high density areas, bobcats were also lower density in general. And, oh, here I have another video. Forgot to put this one on, but this is an interesting one of them kind of coming in at the same time as a bobcat and just kicking the bobcat out. And the bobcat going, where did my food go? And he came back. So who came to these carcasses? Well, coyotes came, but they were actually more likely to visit when they were treated with pumicide. So I think maybe it's because coyotes have such a good sense of smell and they are scavengers that maybe they're actually attracted to it. And especially in areas with higher development. So it's possible that pumas are pretty low and common in areas of higher development. So coyotes either have less fear of them because they have less interaction with them, or they just don't fear them anymore because they know they're not that common. So they actually were more likely to visit, which wasn't what we predicted. And it was also, their presence was slightly associated with higher forest cover and housing. Foxes also visited, but they really didn't visit when coyotes showed up. So this might be a reflection of the fact that foxes weren't very common in places where there were coyotes, or it's because foxes just avoided them because they knew or they could smell the coyotes. Again, they were attracted by pumas' scent. So maybe because they're scavengers, pumas leave a lot of food lying around, so it could be a good thing to hone in on. The foxes we found were actually really sensitive to housing. So as housing, even if we look at housing at a 1,000-meter scale, so that's like taking 1,000 meters and putting it on top of a housing point in your GIS program. So it goes, just imagining the effect of that house goes out 1,000 meters. So that's really interesting because gray foxes are also known to live in urban centers, like in Berkeley. So I don't know why these ones are sensitive, but like I said, animals have a lot of individual variation. And then bobcats were pretty sensitive, but not as sensitive. So at 100 meters, which means the impact of the house really only goes out 100 meters. And if they're 120 meters away, they aren't really impacted by it. But they did visit baits later when they were treated by pumas. So it showed that they had some kind of behavioral response to pumas, and they were the only one that really did. So they spent less time at baits that had pumicide, and they showed up later. So I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because they're both cats, so there's more competition, or maybe it's because bobcats are not big scavengers. They kill a lot of their own things, so they're less likely to take risks. So they're less attracted by the puma scent. But we found some, general responses both to the pumas, not necessarily in the ways that we predicted, and also to development. Again, we were surprised because we thought bobcats would be more sensitive than gray foxes. We actually found the opposite. So we found, like you saw earlier, we saw all 6 species that we were studying, observed the carcasses. Don't have time, so I'm not going to go into possums, raccoons, and skunks. And we saw that all these variables, treatment, whether coyotes were there, how forested it was, and how much housing there was, impacted who showed up. The behavior we also saw was somewhat influenced by top predators, and again, in ways that we didn't expect. Foxes did avoid coyotes, which we expected, but foxes and coyotes were actually attracted by puma scent, and bobcats were the only ones that seemed to be deterred, but not deterred enough that they didn't show up. And the other things that were surprising were the responses to housing, with foxes being actually more sensitive. But we didn't see housing impacts on scavenging behavior, at least the aspects of scavenging behavior that we looked at. So those kind of 3 sections were the scientific parts that I was looking at for my dissertation. But then, again, I just want to briefly talk a little bit about the things that we did to engage the public and continue to do to engage the public. So we do a lot of public outreach, either by giving talks or taking kids out. And again, this is because we want people to, one, understand why these animals are behaving the way they are, and to support whatever management recommendations that may arise from our understanding, our new findings of this. So the other thing that I try to do in my PhD was to do outreach through the internet. And here's just a graph of how often people use the internet now. And it's, as you guys all know, it's ubiquitous, basically. So we try to engage people online, because that's a bigger presence than just talking to people in person. So one is our Puma tracker, which looks different from this now, but you can track kind of all the pumas that we've tracked over the last 6 years, or 6 to 8 years, and click on each of these pumas and see their home range and where they've moved. We also built a Facebook game while I was a PhD student, where we let people look at our camera trap photos and actually, identify what kind of animal it was. So there was an explore mode where you could look at the pictures and it would tell you what animal it was, and there was also a game mode where you could look at it and try to identify yourself what it was. So now that I'm graduating, we don't have any more funding. It'd be great to continue it, but we don't have any money to keep our computer scientists working on it. But it was kind of cool, and we looked at, for each of these pictures, what the animal actually was, because these were animals we identified, and we looked at how it was identified by the public, and we were able to see how well the public could identify the pictures. And it was actually pretty good. If there was a good agreement by the public, then we have a 90% chance that it was a correct identification. So the goal of this is to see if we could use kind of crowdsourcing to identify pictures, because I had hundreds of thousands of photos, which I was able to identify by using interns, but it'd be cool to involve the public as well. So just to kind of go back to the main point of the talk, and I didn't actually talk about the conservation success that we had, which was right now we're in the midst of helping build an underpass, or expand an underpass under Highway 17, and also protect the areas on both sides of Highway 17 as a result of the findings that we have from our GPS tracks. But we were able to do that because we understood, we had some targeted actions, and we understood the animal behavior, so we knew where the animals wanted to cross and why did they want to cross there. So we can tell people, this is where you need to protect. And we also had public support, because we'd been talking to people a lot. There was lots of interest. Luckily, because it's a top carnivore, it's harder for something like a beetle or a burrowing owl, maybe. But because it was a top carnivore, there was a lot of public support, and this isn't just to benefit mountain lions, it was to benefit a wide array of species. So I think with these two things in concert, having an understanding of what you need, and then having support to enact the appropriate management actions, you can actually do something, that's actually going to help the natural community. And in this case, that's what we're working towards with the Santa Cruz Puma Project, not just for pumas, but we're hoping our technologies and our methods can work for other species as well. So just to let you know, we have a lot of collaborators on this work, a lot of people from UC Santa Cruz who've worked on it, a couple of people who were from other universities and then came to UC Santa Cruz to do postdocs. Terry Williams is the scientist who does all the physiological work. And Gabe Elkheim is an engineer who worked on the collars. And a lot of the names are graduate students in my lab. And then, of course, we had lots of field assistants. We also had a lot of interns in the lab who looked at the photos, but too many names, and I accidentally didn't put them on there. We had a lot of good funding for this project. Putting collars on mountain lions is really expensive. You need trucks, you need collars, each of which costs $7,000. Then you need a monitor, and each year costs several $100s just to pay for the subscription fee. So lots of funding went into it. But I think the information that we got was not just useful for mountain lions, but useful for the Santa Cruz Mountains in general, and also, is being implemented in other species now. So not only did we get funding for the science, we were able to work with Santa Cruz Land Trust to then get funding for the land that's needed to protect the pumas. And so that's it. And thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I know there's a lot of information thrown at you, but we've been learning a lot about the pumas, so I was excited to share them.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
cameras that you had up, were they all put up at the same time, or were they rotated around?
They were, so I had 50 cameras. They weren't all put up at the same time because there were logistic difficulties, you know, but they overlapped a lot. Some of them were put up earlier, and it took time to get all of them up, and then some of them had to be changed from one place to another because either it got stolen or that location didn't work anymore. But eventually they overlapped for a bit, and then some of them got taken out earlier because they were put up earlier. Yeah.
And the cost of the 3 different technologies that you talked about, what's the cost of each?
Well, the GPS collar is the most expensive, and that's probably, you know, $5,000 to $7,000 for the collar. The accelerometer is not really that expensive. You just put it in the GPS collar. The cameras are pretty cheap, about a couple $100s each. So put them together, it's still like, you know, $12,000 plus including batteries and the case and SD cards. Yeah, so probably $15,000 to do something like that. But now we have 100 cameras out on a more large-scale monitoring thing that's on a 4-kilometer grid. So, but the cameras are a lot cheaper now. They used to be, you know, you can still get really nice fancy cameras for $800, but now you can get pretty good ones for $100 to $200.
Okay.
Yeah.
Along this line, Yiwei, was it satellite trackers, GPS?
Yes, satellite. Yeah.
Do we have an idea of what is the population number for pumas right now?
Yeah, our guess is about 50 to 70 adults in the Santa Cruz Mountains, kind of going up to San Mateo. We don't really know what's too much north of there because we don't study it out there. So with the population right now, the size is pretty good. We don't know how many kittens there are, but we do know there's lots of turnover. So where a natural population that's not hunted, a mountain lion can probably live 8 to 12 years. Ours, they generally live only about 5 because they tend to get shot or get run over. And there's also conflict between mountain lions, which we don't know if it's exacerbated by them getting shot all the time and having new kind of territories open up and new animals coming in, which may cause more fights. Because once you establish, know your neighbors, it's generally pretty peaceful. But if animals are getting killed pretty regularly, you're getting new neighbors all the time, which may be more opportunities for conflict. That's it.
Yiwei, how are these numbers varying over time? I guess we don't have a good sense, but do we
The population?
think the population's gone through a crash and is recovered, or is it?
Yeah, well, they were heavily hunted for the first half of the 20th century. We don't even know if there were any mountain lions left in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So there are some DNA studies being done. There may have been a bottleneck and it's recovered, or they may all be new animals that have migrated in. So there's definitely been, I would say there's probably an increase in population since the 60s when they stopped getting hunted. The other interesting thing is that hunted populations actually occur at higher densities than unhunted ones. And that's true of coyotes and wolves too, because they breed more or have smaller territories in response to getting killed. So we could have more than we would have 300 years ago when they weren't really being heavily hunted. Even though technically they're not hunted now, they're still killed pretty regularly. But we don't know that. But they are pretty self-managing. The males will kill off other males, so they can never reach a super high population density. And females are more limited by being able to find food. So we have a lot of females. We're trying to study the kitten survival, and there's some anecdotal evidence that kitten survival isn't so good closer to people. So they may be turning over having kittens more. But yeah, they're always limited by the male kind of aggression. So they can never get too high.
What about deer population?
Well, that's what the big grid camera study is trying to do, is to try to get a sense of the deer. The deer are pretty hard to study because we were trying to figure out ways to study the deer here, but using distance sampling methods was impossible because the roads are all super curvy and there's mountains and trees, so you can't really see very far. There's another way where you can do pellet counts, but that's very time consuming. So we're trying to see if we can use a grid camera system too.